On Sunday, January 13th, 2008, Rhonda Smith sat in the back pew of the historic Trinity Lutheran Church in tiny Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, doing her best to try to stay calm. The 42-year-old choir singer knew that her pastor, Greg Shreves, would soon call her up to the pulpit to speak, so she was keeping a close eye on him, waiting for his signal. The winter sun streamed in through the stained glass windows of the 18th century sanctuary, and the rays caught the minister's beautiful pale blue eyes. And when this happened, Rhonda noticed, and right away she couldn't help but think to herself how unbelievably handsome the minister really was. At age 56, Shreves was an unlikely minister. He had spent decades as a country club golf pro and official on the professional golf tour before answering God's call in 2005. Shreves was more than 6 feet tall and very fit, and he had blonde hair that was still visible amongst his grays. And he was single. Now, Rhonda was not romantically involved with her minister. To her mind, it was just more of an intimate friendship. But she was deeply touched by everything the minister had done for her. On this particular Sunday, as Rhonda sat nervously in the pew, Pastor Shreves announced that a fundraising campaign he had launched to help Rhonda with her expenses had brought in $3,000. Then Pastor Shreves gave the signal to Rhonda for her to come up and say a few words. And so when Rhonda stood up and began walking towards the pulpit, the 100 or so people in the pews immediately began to applaud and cheer as she walked towards the front. By the time Rhonda was standing at the pulpit next to Pastor Shreves, she was totally embarrassed, but also very touched. Rhonda had actually asked Pastor Shreves for this opportunity to thank the whole congregation, but now that she was actually up there, she was shaking with anxiety. She looked over at Pastor Shreves, who nodded warmly to her, as if to say, "You can do this." So Rhonda took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She would tell the members of the church that in the 2 years since she had been attending Trinity Lutheran, she had felt welcomed with open arms. This really felt like her home. Rhonda's voice broke as she admitted to the struggles in her life, struggles that many in the congregation already knew about. Rhonda was unable to work full-time because of her battles with mental illness, which had driven her at times to thoughts of suicide. She had been in danger of being evicted from her apartment because she couldn't afford her bills when Pastor Shreves stepped in and began raising money for her. Rhonda tearfully said she owed a debt of gratitude to everyone in the sanctuary as she looked out at all the beaming faces. Out in the crowd was Judy Zellner, a 60-year-old grandmother who was Rhonda's best friend at church. Judy had actually introduced herself to Rhonda on the very first day that Rhonda had shown up at Trinity. And in no time, they were having lunches together like old pals. There was also Mary Jane Fonder, who was also out in the pews, and she was a singer in the choir with Rhonda. Mary Jane was 65 years old and very eccentric. She often wore a wig, sometimes backwards, but she was so kind. One time, when Rhonda was not feeling very well, Mary Jane had baked her a blueberry pie as a way to cheer her up. And of course, there was Pastor Shreves standing right next to Rhonda, who had taken Rhonda under his wing and even offered her temporary work in the church office. Rhonda had never met a man that was so caring and loving. To close out her speech, Rhonda, again very tearfully, told the congregation how thankful she was, and she also said, I don't know what would have happened to me without all of your love and support, so thank you. And then after that, the room broke into applause again. As Rhonda stepped down from the pulpit, Pastor Shreves made a show of smiling really wide and winking right at Rhonda, really letting her know how special she was. And as she walked back to her pew, feeling very special, she couldn't help but wonder if any of the other women in the congregation felt just a little jealous because of her obvious close relationship to Pastor Shreves, someone that all the women really seemed to like in this church. But just then, Rhonda noticed someone unfamiliar sitting in her row. The man had a gray beard, messy hair, and he wore glasses. His clothes looked rumpled, and Rhonda noticed that he was actually the only person in the entire church who was not clapping for her. The following Sunday, Rhonda did not go to church. Instead, she was sobbing uncontrollably on the phone with a mental health counselor, saying that she was a failure and couldn't drag herself out of bed. Social workers were so worried about her that they visited Rhonda's apartment just to make sure she didn't hurt herself. When they got there, they found Rhonda in her pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept for days. The social workers really wanted her to sign up for an inpatient treatment program, but Rhonda said absolutely not. She was supposed to start work as a temporary secretary for the church on Monday, and she was not about to miss that, even if it meant giving up going into this treatment program. She had made a promise to Pastor Shreves that she would do this job, and she was not about to let him down. Rhonda knew that she was repeating a familiar pattern. Just when something good was right within reach, she would have a mental breakdown that kind of ruined it. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, but these bouts of depression and anorexia had kind of doomed her ambitions. Now she was unemployed in her 40s, and her romantic life was not much better. Rhonda was a smart and attractive person, but her relationships always fell apart. At one point, she had poured her heart out to Pastor Shreves about her history of bad boyfriends. And when she did, he put his arm around her and he reminded her that it only takes one good person. Pastor Shreves called that Sunday night to check in on Rhonda after she didn't come to church. He wanted to make sure Rhonda was okay, but he also wanted to make sure that she'd be able to work the next day. The pastor was going to be away at a conference, and so he needed someone there at the church to answer the phones. And Rhonda promised him she would be there bright and early. By Wednesday morning, so 3 days into her temporary job, Rhonda had learned the routine of her new job, but it was making her lonely. From 9 to 5 every day, Rhonda was supposed to sit in this little plain office inside of the church and just wait for the phone to ring. With Pastor Shreves gone, she was the only person in the church, so she had no one to talk to while she worked and way too much time to think about her own problems. But on this Wednesday, she did her best to cheer herself up by reminding herself that she had a date that day after work. He was a nice man that she'd met in a bipolar disorder support group, so maybe he would understand the ups and downs of her life. But right now, the end of the day when that date was going to start seemed really far off to Rhonda. Rhonda wished someone, anyone, would call just to break up the monotony of the day. Even if that call came from the very eccentric, backwards wig-wearing Mary Jane Fonder, who often called the church and seemed totally confused. In fact, Mary Jane had called the church on Rhonda's first day of work on Monday, and when Mary Jane realized that Rhonda was filling in for the receptionist, Mary Jane promptly wished Rhonda a belated happy birthday. It was not Rhonda's birthday, but she said that she appreciated Mary Jane's thoughtfulness. But then Mary Jane began asking Rhonda, well, why didn't you invite me to your birthday party? Rhonda had said there was no party, but Mary Jane just did not believe her. Rhonda had finally made an excuse to get off the phone. But now, 2 days later, sitting in this room feeling so bored, left with these horrible thoughts in her head, Rhonda kind of wished Mary Jane would call. At least it was something to do. Rhonda had talked to mental health counselors 4 times in the past week as she felt herself slipping into the blackness of depression. Her parents were really worried about her. Her dad called her every morning just to hear Rhonda reassure him that she was up and at 'em. Rhonda wished that she really felt that way. At 10:55 a.m. that day, the metallic clunk of the church's side door opening broke the silence. Rhonda thought it might be Pastor Shreves, back from his conference earlier than expected, and for a moment, she was really excited. Rhonda swiveled around her chair, getting ready to greet the minister, but to her surprise, it was not Pastor Shreves. It was somebody else, and she couldn't really understand why they were there. But what surprised Rhonda even more was what this person was carrying in their hand. Two hours later, at 1 p.m., Judy Zellner, who was Rhonda's best friend at church, parked outside of Trinity Church and stepped out of her van into the crisp winter air. Judy had long ago lost her tolerance for cold days like this, and so she made a beeline for the church building. Judy fumbled for her keys, eager to get inside of the warm building. She glanced into the ground floor window of the church offices, but didn't see anybody inside. Judy was the sexton of this church, which, she would joke, was a fancy way of saying she was the cleaning lady. And on this day, that was why she was at the church, to clean it. When Judy finally found the right key and put it inside the lock, she was surprised to find the side door of the church was actually already unlocked. Springfield Township was a community of only 5,000 people with very little crime, but the policy was, on weekdays, the church doors were supposed to be locked. But regardless, Judy stepped through the door and began to peel off her coat, and as she did, she looked up and noticed the door that led into the office where Rhonda was working was open. Judy walked over and stuck her head in the door and called out hello, but nobody called back. So Judy opened the door the rest of the way and she looked into the office, but there was no one sitting behind the desk, there was nobody inside the office, and she was about to leave and go walk around the church to find where this mystery person was who had unlocked the side door, when Judy spotted something just on the side of the desk inside of this office. It was somebody's foot. Judy at first didn't even know what to do, but then instinct took over and she rushed around the desk and she looked down and she could not believe what she was seeing. There was a woman laying face down in a pool of blood that had totally saturated the carpet beneath her. The woman's long brown hair was all matted red, and the side of her face that Judy could see was totally destroyed. It was like a shattered mess of flesh and bone. But whoever this woman was, she was still breathing. Judy could see her chest rising and falling. Judy wanted to roll this person over and try to perform CPR, but she could tell the woman's injuries were just too severe for her to help. Then it dawned on Judy, whoever hurt this person could still be inside the church. And so Judy snatched the church's cordless phone off its cradle and ran outside without her coat. Standing in the parking lot, freezing cold and shaking with fear, Judy dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Judy blurted out that somebody was attacked inside of her church. Paramedics and a state trooper arrived a few minutes later, and Judy showed them to the church office where she had found the woman on the ground. And when the paramedics went in there, the woman on the ground was still alive. And so the paramedics asked Judy to leave the office while they attended to this woman, and so Judy nodded and went back outside again, but then looped around to the side of the building and looked into the office through the window. And when she did, she saw the paramedics lift the woman off the ground and roll her over onto a backboard to take her out to the ambulance. And it was at this point that Judy finally got a look at this woman, and the woman who had been hurt was her dear friend, Rhonda. "17 miles away, Pennsylvania State Trooper Greg Stumpo was eating lunch at his favorite Italian restaurant when he got a call from dispatch. A woman had been apparently shot inside of the Trinity Lutheran Church, and she was barely clinging to life, and so could Stumpo report to the scene. Since Stumpo was the senior officer on his three-man detective team, Stumpo knew he would lead any investigation. Stumpo wolfed down the rest of his chicken parmesan and then hit the road for the church. Even though he had been a detective in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania for almost a decade now, Stumpo really had never gotten to investigate many murders. Springfield Township itself had seen only 2 murders in the entire last 2 decades, and so Stumpo felt a big rush of adrenaline as he drove. By the time Stumpo arrived, the church was already crawling with police looking for physical evidence from the shooting. So Stumpo walked up to one of the other troopers and asked where he could find the woman who made the 911 call, Judy. The trooper immediately turned and pointed out to an idling van out in the parking lot. So Stumpo walked over and he knocked on Judy's window, which totally startled Judy. Judy had been sitting in her vehicle with the windows up, heat blasting, staring straight ahead, so shocked she couldn't even muster any tears. But she turned and looked over at Stumpo, and in his suit and tie, he did not look like a state trooper, and he very likely could tell that's what she was thinking, and so he reached down and picked up his badge and flashed it to her to show her who he was. At that point, Judy lowered down her window, but stayed in her van as she described for Stumpo what happened when she walked inside of the church. She would tell Stumpo that when she first walked into the office, the woman on the floor was so bloody and mangled that Judy didn't recognize that it was her good friend Rhonda. And Judy said at first she was positive this woman on the ground was dead, but then she realized her chest was rising and falling, and so she was still alive. Judy couldn't understand why anybody would want to hurt her friend Rhonda. Judy described Rhonda as being very sweet and shy, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She said the two of them had hit it off immediately when they first met, and they had become very close friends, despite the 20-year age difference between them. But Judy also told Stumpo that Rhonda had a dark side too. She struggled with bouts of depression that at times left her totally unable to function, and one time Rhonda had been so suicidal that she had to be hospitalized 5 years earlier. And Judy said, lately it seemed like Rhonda was slipping back into a depression. Stumpo was expressionless as he listened to Judy, but inside, based on what she was saying, he was beginning to wonder if maybe this was an attempted suicide rather than an attempted murder. But there was an immediate complication to that theory. Police had not recovered a weapon. If Rhonda shot herself, shouldn't the gun be right there at the scene? Maybe even still in her hand? After speaking with Judy, Stumpo went back inside the church and over to the church office where Rhonda had been found. And when he went in there, he noticed there was now a black tape outline of where Rhonda's body had been, and it was on this part of the rug that was now totally covered in blood. Stumpo got down on his hands and knees to see if maybe there was a gun under the desk or some of the other furniture nearby, but there was nothing. And then an idea occurred to Stumpo. Did someone help Rhonda shoot herself, perhaps disposing of the weapon for her afterwards? He went back outside to Judy's van and asked directly if she removed a gun from the office. Judy was totally offended at the very idea. She had been careful not to disturb anything. But while Stumpo was inside, Judy said she had thought of someone that police might want to speak with. Judy said she recalled a very unkempt-looking stranger who had come to their church earlier in January when Rhonda had stood up before the congregation, and that was the first time that Judy had ever seen this guy. Judy said that on that day, as the donation plate was passed around, she overheard the stranger say something about how this church would be a good place to rob. Judy had not taken this comment seriously, but now she wondered, did this man shoot Rhonda while he was attempting to rob the church? Stumpo took down Judy's description of this man and figured it was possible that the stranger had come back to the church to rob it. Maybe Rhonda was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Stumpo headed to his car, he asked one of the troopers to make sure they spoke to the minister and see if he could figure out if anything valuable was missing from the church. After that, Stumpo drove to St. Luke's Hospital, where paramedics had taken Rhonda. Once he was there, he found Rhonda in a private room, heavily bandaged and unconscious. Her forlorn-looking parents stood vigil at her bedside. The doctor told Stumpo before he entered that Rhonda was being kept alive by machines, and it was very unlikely that she would survive after so much brain damage and loss of blood. Rhonda's parents, Jim and Dorothy Smith, who were both in their 70s, agreed to step outside to a waiting area with Stumpo where they could all chat. Stumpo brought them coffee in styrofoam cups, and he sat down and started by saying how very sorry he was about what had happened. Then Rhonda's father, Jim, told Stumpo about Rhonda's long struggle with bipolar disorder and the many times their daughter had flirted with suicide. Jim said he would never let Rhonda keep a gun around her apartment, and he would never keep one at his own house. Luckily, Jim added, the one time Rhonda had tried shooting a gun, she had hated it. And so Jim told Stumpo that he thought it was very unlikely that Rhonda would ever shoot herself. Jim told Stumpo that he and his wife Dorothy had not actually seen their daughter earlier that day. However, they had spoken to her around 8:30 a.m., and she sounded like she was in a good mood. Then again, Jim said, because of Rhonda's condition, her moods could sometimes change on a dime. 4 hours after that conversation, so at about 12:30 p.m., Jim and Dorothy had driven past the church on their way to lunch, and they saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. The parents talked about stopping by and taking their daughter out for a bite, but they figured Rhonda was busy. Employment had been scarce for Rhonda, so they continued past the church and wound up eating lunch without her. The detective listened carefully and very sympathetically, but internally, he didn't get the feeling that these parents were going to actually offer up any information that could actually help investigators. But at the end of the conversation, Jim said something somewhat off the cuff to Stumpo that made Stumpo pause. Jim said that he prayed his daughter had not tried to kill herself. He and his wife were very religious, and they believed anybody who even attempted suicide faced eternal damnation, and so they couldn't bear such a fate for their beloved child. As the parents got up to leave, Jim told Stumpo that he really hoped investigators would not find a gun at the church. Jim's parting remark left Stumpo wondering whether they were telling the truth when they said they did not stop at the church on the way to lunch. Maybe, he thought, they walked into the church only to find their daughter lying on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The parents could have mistakenly believed their daughter was already dead, and maybe they took the weapon from the scene so it didn't look like a suicide. Stumpo knew this idea was a total long shot, but it was too early to rule out anything. Just as Stumpo was about to walk out the front door of the hospital, he spotted a tall, middle-aged man with a priest collar in the hospital lobby. The man dabbed at his eyes and composed himself before pressing the elevator button. Stumpo walked over to him and asked the man if he was Pastor Shreves from Trinity Lutheran. Shreves nodded and said he was on his way up to minister to Rhonda's family. Stumpo asked him if he wouldn't mind speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and Pastor Shreves agreed. Shreves was so anxious to get up to Rhonda's bedside that he could barely sit still while the two men talked. Shreves said, he blamed himself for what happened because he had not been at the church to protect Rhonda. The pastor admitted that he really didn't know what he was going to say to Rhonda's parents when he got up there, or what he was going to say to the congregation. Despite his age, Shreves had only just graduated from the seminary 3 years earlier. Before that, he was competing in golf tournaments, and so nothing in his limited experience as a minister had prepared him for something like this. The pastor also said he didn't know Rhonda all that well, and he couldn't remember when she actually first joined the congregation. He described her as a very quiet, lonely young woman who had struggled with mental health issues. Stumpo sized up the minister as he spoke. The man was very handsome, as Judy had mentioned to Stumpo, but what really stood out to Stumpo was not this guy's good looks, but the fact that he did not see Rhonda as a close friend. He actually said, he was not that close with her. Judy had told Stumpo that Rhonda saw the pastor as a very dear friend and mentor. And so to Stumpo, it seemed very clear that Rhonda and Pastor Shreves' relationship was very imbalanced. However, Pastor Shreves did know enough about Rhonda to suggest to Stumpo that he really should look into Rhonda's troubled love life. Shreves said that Rhonda had told him at one point that she had been in a very abusive relationship a few years ago, and things had actually gotten so bad that Rhonda sought the help of a domestic abuse center. Shreves said he didn't know who this ex-boyfriend was, but it was clear to him that their relationship still weighed on Rhonda years after they parted ways. Pastor Shreves told Stumpo that Rhonda also had a more recent breakup with a man she had met online who lived in Philadelphia. Shreves said that as far as he knew, Rhonda and this guy had gone on a few dates, but then at some point the guy had stopped returning Rhonda's calls, and that had left Rhonda feeling very sad and very wounded. Shortly after this, Stumpo and Shreves wrapped up their conversation, and Stumpo headed out the door. And as Stumpo left the hospital, his head was spinning. He had only been investigating the shooting of Rhonda Smith for a few hours, but he already had an array of theories. Did she shoot herself? Was she caught up in an armed robbery? Was she a victim of an abusive former boyfriend? He couldn't prove or disprove any of these. 2 hours later, around 6 p.m., Stumpo got a phone call from another detective, and they told him that Rhonda Smith was dead. Her parents had asked the doctors to take her off life support when it became clear she had absolutely no brain activity. And so the case now was no longer an attempted suicide or murder, it simply was a suicide or a murder. Rhonda was supposed to go on a date on the night that she died, and so Stumpo wasted no time figuring that out and then tracking the date down. The man's name was Gregory Danisavage, and Stumpo found him at his house just before 8 p.m., and he was still dressed in slacks and a blazer for his date that would never happen. Gregory said he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 p.m., but she didn't show, and she didn't send him a message to explain. And so he had sat outside in his car for a while, and then finally just went home, hoping that nothing had happened to her. Unfortunately, Stumpo said, something had happened to her, but he wouldn't provide any details. Stumpo asked where Gregory had been late on Wednesday morning, and he had a ready answer. He said he was taking care of his mother as she recovered from surgery. Now seeming a bit nervous, Gregory told Stumpo that the last guy Rhonda had been dating might have wanted to harm her. And so he said, Rhonda feared that that guy was just using her for sex, and so she had tried to slow the relationship down. But when she did that, the guy basically stopped calling her, at which point Rhonda began calling him, but he never picked up. Stumpo thanked Gregory for the tip, and then he left. However, when Stumpo followed up on Gregory's tip about this previous guy who Rhonda had been seeing, who apparently was just using her for sex, well, Stumpo quickly determined that it was a total dead end. The guy's name was Ray Finkel, and he would tell Stumpo that he had only gone on 4 dates with Rhonda, and he had stopped calling her really just because her house was too far away. Finkel said he was working all day Wednesday, the day that Rhonda was killed, and he had the security card check-in to prove it. As Stumpo ended the call with Ray Finkel, he was thinking that neither Gregory nor Ray even knew Rhonda well enough to want her dead. these were not exactly torrid love affairs. However, the abusive ex-boyfriend that Pastor Shreves had warned about turned out to be a much darker story. A social worker at the domestic abuse center that Rhonda had called said that Rhonda had accused this man of sexually assaulting her 4 years ago and getting her pregnant. Rhonda eventually got an abortion, but the social worker said that Rhonda was haunted by the experience. Then the social worker said that as part of Rhonda's therapy, she kept a journal of her relationship with her abuser. And so the social worker told Stumpo that maybe that journal would give investigators the information that they needed. Rhonda's parents gave Stumpo the spare key to their daughter's apartment. And then when Stumpo went into the apartment, inside of a desk drawer, he found all these yellow legal pads that were filled with Rhonda's writing. And the writing included all the intimate details of her past relationship with this man who had hurt her so badly. They painted a picture of a very unhappy romance, one that continued even after she accused this man of abuse. But Rhonda indicated in her more recent entries that she had not had any contact with this guy for 2 whole years. And so this abusive boyfriend really seemed like a bad person, but he didn't really fit the profile of Rhonda's murderer because he had not interacted with her in years. And so Stumpo now understood why people said Rhonda was unlucky in love, but so far, nothing in her past seemed to add up to a motive for murder. While Stumpo tracked down the rest of Rhonda's boyfriends, other members of his team began to look into that strange newcomer to the church, the kind of disheveled-looking guy who Judy had overheard say, Trinity Lutheran would be a good place to rob. Well, despite having a great description of this guy within 24 hours of the shooting, he was about 5'10", he wore wire-rimmed glasses and had scraggly salt and pepper hair. Despite having this description, none of the state databases of criminals and people on parole or probation contained anyone who looked like this stranger. Now, of course, Stumpo didn't just rule him out as a potential suspect simply because he couldn't find him. However, at the same time, the whole robbery idea just seemed kind of unlikely to Stumpo. Pastor Shreves had told Stumpo that the church rarely had any cash inside, and the pastor actually looked all around the church and couldn't find anything missing following the shooting. So if Rhonda really was the victim of a robbery gone bad, then why wasn't anything stolen? And so 2 days into this investigation, and Stumpo had almost nothing to show for all his effort. He wasn't even sure if he was investigating a murder or a suicide. A few days later, on Monday afternoon, January 28th, so 5 days after the murder, Stumpo sat in the balcony of the church as Pastor Shreves led Rhonda's memorial service below. More than 250 people had packed into the church to show their love for Rhonda. Stumpo looked down and saw Rhonda's parents sitting in the front row, and as he did, he considered the possibility that, the parents had covered up their daughter's suicide. It seemed extremely unlikely, but it was still possible. Then Stumpo scanned around the rest of the teary-eyed parishioners and thought to himself, if Rhonda did not kill herself, then the culprit was probably in this room. After the service ended, Stumpo waited for the crowd to thin, then he asked Pastor Shreves if he had a few minutes. Shreves walked Stumpo out of the church and across the parking lot to the small ranch house where he lived. As they reached his porch, Stumpo noticed an apple pie sitting in front of the side door to the house, but Pastor Shreves was not happy about this pie. As soon as he read the note that was sitting on top of the pie, Shreves expressed his irritation. He explained to Stumpo that one of the members of the church would often leave food for him, even though he had asked her to stop. Stumpo asked Shreves who this woman was, and Shreves would say her name was Mary Jane. The same Mary Jane who was very eccentric and wore her wigs backwards, and at one point had actually baked a pie for Rhonda. Shreves would say, Mary Jane was a member of the church's choir and she was a talented artist whose paintings hung on the walls of the church. But he said, I think she has a crush on me. And as the pastor talked, Stumpo remembered how people at the church said there was like this running joke that, Pastor Shreves was single and handsome, and basically all the women who went to this church had crushes on him, and some of them liked to bring him unsolicited gifts like food. And so Stumpo was pretty sure that Rhonda Smith must be one of these admirers, just like Mary Jane was. And, that was probably why their relationship seemed so imbalanced, with Rhonda looking at the pastor as this mentor and close friend, and the pastor basically being like, yeah, I know Rhonda, she's nice, but that's about it. Over the next few days, the events on the morning of the shooting became increasingly clear as investigators talked to more people and collected records. On the day Rhonda died, she had called a mental health crisis line from the church just after 10 a.m., saying she felt suicidal. Then at 10:55, she stopped using the church internet service, suggesting she was either shot right before then or right after that point. And so in Stumpo's mind, it was easy to imagine a desperate, lonely person making one last call for help before just ending it all. But then, on January 30th, Stumpo received the autopsy report. Sitting at his desk in the police barracks 15 miles from Springfield Township, Stumpo marveled at what he read in the report. It didn't solve the case by any means, but it did make one thing clear. This was no suicide. The medical examiner found that Rhonda had been shot twice. The first bullet glanced off her forehead, while the second round penetrated her skull. What's more, the shots were fired from 3 or 4 feet away, suggesting that the shooter was on the other side of the desk from Rhonda. The coroner said Rhonda's head had none of the tiny burn marks that are associated with shots fired at extremely close range, like a suicide gunshot would be. And so Stumpo concluded that, while Rhonda may have been depressed, she certainly did not pull the trigger to end her own life. She was definitely murdered. About a week later, on the evening of February 6th, Stumpo and another investigator named Bob Egan arrived at Trinity Lutheran Church just before 7 p.m. when choir practice was about to begin. One of the few members of the church community they had not spoken with yet was Mary Jane Fonder, though they had heard a lot about her. Mostly that she was very eccentric, wore her wig backwards sometimes, and periodically dropped off pies for the pastor and for Rhonda. And so Stumpo and the other investigator walked into the church, and right away they spotted Mary Jane along with the other members of the choir getting ready to start their practice, and the investigators flagged Mary Jane and asked her to come with them so they could talk to her in a side room. But as they were walking over to this room, Mary Jane said to them that she had actually been meaning to reach out to them because she had spoken to Rhonda a couple of days before she was killed. Mary Jane said she had called into the church and was surprised when Rhonda answered and not the normal secretary. But Mary Jane said she had actually just taken the time to talk to Rhonda because Mary Jane had been worried about Rhonda's state of mind, like many other people in the church were. And so Mary Jane told the investigators that Rhonda apparently had such a crush on Pastor Shreves that at least to Mary Jane, it seemed like it was clouding her judgment. And the example that Mary Jane gave to show this was she said the minister had organized a birthday party for Rhonda just before her death, and Rhonda had not invited Mary Jane to attend, even though in Mary Jane's eyes, they were close friends. And so it just seemed like Rhonda was being weirdly protective of Pastor Shreves and didn't want other women there. Mary Jane would also tell the investigators that she was just too upset to even attend Rhonda's memorial service, but she had baked a pie for Rhonda's parents and visited with them after the service. Then Detective Egan asked Mary Jane point blank, did she own a gun? And Mary Jane kind of laughed and said no, and she wouldn't even know how to use one. So the detectives thanked Mary Jane for her time, and then she turned and headed back over to choir practice, and the detectives walked out of the church feeling like they were no closer to solving this crime. But having now met Mary Jane, she seemed less like this totally eccentric, weird person that people had made her out to be, and more just like a very harmless old lady. The following day, February 7th, Stumpo learned that the state police were reassigning the other 2 detectives in his unit to other cases that weren't even murders. Stumpo knew what that meant. His bosses were losing confidence in his investigation because he was not making enough progress. And so now the Rhonda murder investigation was down to just him and Detective Egan, who was on loan from headquarters. And as weeks passed by, still with no breakthrough, Stumpo began to worry that they might never solve this crime. But Detective Egan, who was a veteran homicide investigator, kept saying that you never know when a hot tip will come in the door. And that's exactly what happened on a cold and windy morning on Saturday, March 29th, nearly 9 weeks after Rhonda's murder. 6 miles from Trinity Lutheran Church, a man and his 8-year-old son were fishing in Lake Nakamixon under the bridge that runs across it. At some point, the boy noticed something shiny in the muddy, shallow water at the lake's edge. he pulled what looked like a toy gun out of the water and showed off his trophy to his dad. But when the boy's father took a look, he realized his son was not holding a toy, it was a real gun. The father snatched the revolver from the boy's hands and immediately popped open the cylinder and shook the weapon to make sure it was not loaded. 3 live rounds fell into the mud, plus the casing from a bullet which had already been fired. The boy's father called the state police barracks where Stumpo worked to report that his son had found a loaded gun in the lake, and the man wondered what he should do with it. The trooper who answered this phone call, whose name was Andrew Mincer, had been the first police officer on the scene at the Rhonda Smith shooting, and he immediately thought of the missing weapon from that crime. Mincer asked the father for the serial number on the gun, and after he got it, he told the father to hang onto the gun and give it to nobody else until he, Mincer, could get there to pick it up. As soon as Mincer hung up the phone, he ran the serial number through the National Crime Information Center, and in minutes, he learned who the Rossi .38 revolver was registered to. Stumpo was in the police barracks when this call came in, but he was down in the locker room thinking about how little time he had spent with his 5-year-old son lately. Police work was literally taking over Stumpo's life, and he had so little to show for it. Stumpo was about to head home when his cell phone rang. The call was coming from within the station he was standing in, and so Stumpo sighed at the thought of even more police work to do. But the instant Stumpo answered, Mincer, who was very excited, told him that a little boy who had been fishing out in Lake Nakamixon had just found a .38 caliber revolver just like the one that had been fired at Rhonda Smith. Mincer said the gun was purchased in 1994, 14 years before Rhonda's murder. But despite being a bit old and having been in the water, it still appeared to be in working condition. And so Stumpo suddenly felt totally energized, and he couldn't help but think, this sounds like we have just found the murder weapon. The next day was a Sunday, but the ballistics expert at the state trooper barracks happened to be in the crime lab that day, working on another case. Stumpo convinced him to drop what he was doing and test the gun the boy found in the lake against the slug that the coroner pulled from Rhonda. And the test proved the revolver found in the lake was the one that killed Rhonda. The next day, Detective Stumpo and Egan visited the address associated with the original owner of the gun. And the property they went to was this rundown cabin at the end of a long driveway sitting on 11 acres of woods. Stumpo and Egan knew that this address was probably an important break in the case, but it didn't mean the original owner of this gun was definitely Rhonda's killer. It had been 14 years since this revolver was purchased, so plenty of time for the gun to change hands may be off the books. After Stumpo knocked, an old man wearing a dress shirt and a plastic pocket protector opened the door just a crack and peered out very suspiciously at the detectives. Egan asked if it would be okay if they came inside and spoke to him, and the man very reluctantly opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside to let them come in. Stumpo and Egan were appalled by what they saw inside. The house was a hoarder's den. Junk-filled boxes and papers piled high and covered with cobwebs and bird droppings. The entire place just totally reeked, to the point where both detectives were breathing through their mouths just so they didn't have to smell the air. Now, the police knew this man was not the original owner of the gun. It was actually his sister who lived with him. And so the detectives asked him if his sister was home, but the man said she wasn't. So the detectives asked him if he knew that his sister had at one point purchased a .38 revolver. The man said that his sister had trouble with a coworker several years back and felt kind of threatened, so she had bought a gun. But she only shot it once in the yard for practice, and the noise was apparently too much for her. Her brother said that she had thrown the gun away years ago, and he didn't know where she threw it away, and he had never seen it or heard about it again. But Stumpo and Egan were not fully convinced about this story. They told the brother that the gun had just been pulled out of the lake. If the gun had been tossed into the water in 1994, shortly after his sister bought it, then by now it would be totally covered in rust. But the gun had no rust on it, which indicated it had not been in the lake for more than a few weeks. The brother fell quiet for a moment, and then told the investigators that he did have something to show them. He took them outside to his car, and he lifted the driver's floor mat to reveal something which shocked the two investigators, and it confirmed that they were on the right track. The old man showed the detectives shiny pieces of metal that were underneath the floor mat of his car. and the detectives immediately recognized these fragments as being part of a bullet casing. Now, when that boy had found the gun in the lake, it had contained 3 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing. However, investigators knew that Rhonda had been shot twice, so there needed to be 2 spent shell casings. And so far, all they could account for was that one that the boy found in the gun. And now, these fragments on the floor of the car could be, potentially, pieces of that other spent round. At last, Stumpo finally had his primary suspect. It was this old man's sister, the original owner of this gun. And that afternoon, police were able to arrest her right as she left the Trinity Lutheran Church, driving her brother's car. The same car that police had just found those fragments from the shell casing underneath the floor mat. Also, after they made this arrest, police searched the inside of the car, and they found a calendar with January 23rd circled, the day Rhonda was murdered, and over that date on the calendar were the words, "Rhonda murdered." Based on Stumpo and Egan's investigation, here is what really happened on January 23rd, the day Rhonda was murdered. At 10:30 a.m. on January 23rd, the killer slipped into her brother's car and drove to Trinity Lutheran Church. She pulled into the parking lot, and as she did, she looked over at the first-floor office window, and she saw Rhonda sitting inside. The killer got out of the car, walked up to the side door of the church, they unlocked it, and went inside. Once inside, the killer looked around the building and determined that Rhonda was the only person inside. The killer then walked over to the church office where Rhonda was. She went inside, and as soon as she did, Rhonda's face lit up with recognition and a smile, until Rhonda noticed the revolver in the killer's hand. Seconds later, the killer raised the gun, aimed it at Rhonda, and fired. The shot struck Rhonda right in the forehead, knocking her off her chair and onto the floor. The killer rushed around the desk and stood over Rhonda, and right away they noticed the bullet had only grazed Rhonda's forehead. And so with Rhonda writhing in pain on the carpet, the killer backed up a couple of feet and then raised their gun again, aimed it at the side of Rhonda's head, and fired. And this time, the bullet went right into Rhonda's head. Satisfied that Rhonda was now dead, the killer casually left the church and drove to a hair appointment. After the detectives questioned her in connection with the murder, the killer got nervous and decided to get rid of the gun. So the killer borrowed her brother's car, drove 6 miles to that bridge that crossed over Lake Nakamixon, and the killer tossed the gun out the window without even stopping. And then, a month later, the boy and his father would find the gun. It would turn out the original owner of the gun and Rhonda's murderer was none other than the eccentric, backwards wig-wearing, apple pie-making Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane did not see Rhonda as a desperately lonely, depressed person on the brink of suicide. Instead, she saw Rhonda as this pretty young thing who was competing with her, Mary Jane, for the affection and love of Pastor Shreves. Mary Jane was convinced that Rhonda and the pastor were having this romantic love affair, even though they totally were not. In Mary Jane's mind, she believed that she and Pastor Shreves had this undeniable chemistry, and they were meant to be together. And she was sure he felt the same way, even though he repeatedly asked her to stop calling him and to basically leave him alone. The last straw for Mary Jane had been when the pastor had raised money to help Rhonda out, and then got the whole congregation to clap and applaud for her when she was up there speaking. No one ever helped out Mary Jane when she lost her job and needed money, and Mary Jane had been a member of the church for 14 years. Compared to her, Rhonda was a newcomer. So Mary Jane killed Rhonda out of spite and jealousy, and with the hope that once Rhonda was out of the way, Mary Jane would have the pastor all to herself. All of this was obviously delusional, but Mary Jane believed it. And it would turn out this wasn't the first time Mary Jane was connected to a suspicious death. Back in 1993, her 83-year-old father disappeared. Mary Jane, who was his caretaker, claimed that he walked out of the house and never came home. Now, at the time, police did suspect that Mary Jane had killed her father and either completely destroyed his body or managed to hide it really well. And Mary Jane, she remained under suspicion for this death, but police could never prove it. In the end, Mary Jane would be convicted of murdering Rhonda, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However, she would die in prison only 10 years into her sentence. Rachel Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984 in Everett, Washington, which is a city that is located 25 miles north of Seattle and sits on the banks of the Puget Sound, which is a large inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the time of her birth, Rachel's parents, Bill and Denise, already had one child, a daughter named Megan, and so when Rachel arrived, they decided their family was complete. Initially, there was some concern that Rachel could have some health issues because by the time she was 2.5 years old, she still was not talking, and so her parents were concerned she could be deaf. But shortly after they went to a specialist about her hearing, Rachel would say her first words, and then from that point onward, her parents could not get her to be quiet. As a youngster, Rachel had a huge imagination. In preschool, she would pretend her fingers were imaginary friends and she would speak to them during class, often getting in trouble because of this. She also had a prized collection of troll dolls, who she gave very intricate backstories to. By the time Rachel was in grade school, she had developed a keen sense of humor. Specifically, she had the gift of mimicry. She could basically become any of her friends or her family members, and everyone thought it was really funny. In addition to her bubbly personality, Rachel was also a very gifted athlete who was always one of the very best players on her basketball, soccer, volleyball, or track team. All this despite growing to be only 4 foot 11 inches tall. Speaking of her smaller stature, even though she was not self-conscious about it, Rachel did wear 4-inch platform shoes virtually everywhere she went, including just going out to the mailbox. In high school, unsurprisingly, Rachel became very popular. Her father joked that he was her answering machine because her many friends would call the house day and night looking for her. But despite this abundance of friends, Rachel took all of her relationships very seriously. She never forgot anybody's birthday, and she would even sometimes send out these random cards that weren't even on birthdays to her friends and to her family members, just telling them how much she loved them. By 2001, when Rachel was 17 years old and in her 3rd year of high school, it just seemed like she was this amazing person who was destined to live a totally charmed life. However, this would not last. Of all of her friends, Rachel's best friend was an 18-year-old boy named Corey Haynes. She had met him when they were young, and they had quickly become soulmates, at least according to their families. However, their relationship was not a romantic one. It was more of a brother-sister style relationship. They spent nearly all of their time together, and in the rare times they were not together, they could always be found speaking on the phone. In the summer following Rachel's 3rd year of high school, Corey was riding in a car with 3 other students from his and Rachel's school. Rachel was not with them. And at some point, the driver of the vehicle lost control of it and started to flip off the road. And when it finally came to a stop 100 feet away from the road, Corey and one of the other student passengers, a 17-year-old named Levi Whiting, were both unfortunately deceased. When Rachel heard the news about this crash, she fell apart. Not only was Corey literally her best friend in the world, but she was also very close with Levi as well. And so over the rest of that awful summer, Rachel spent most of her time crying in her bedroom, looking at pictures of her and Corey and her and Levi. Her older sister, Megan, would say that Rachel was just beyond heartbroken. It was like all of the joy and happiness that normally characterized her was just gone. Finally, that summer did come to an end, and it was time for Rachel to return to Marysville-Pilchuck High School to begin her 4th and final year. Her family hoped that finally being around some other students again would help heal her and help her move on, but unbelievably, over the course of that school year, 4 more students, all of whom were friends with Rachel, would die. There was a suicide, there was a drowning, a hit and run, and an accidental shooting. It was like the school was cursed. By the second half of that school year, Rachel, like many other students at the school, had become deeply depressed. The trauma of losing so many people close to her had just crushed her spirit. When her grades, which were normally quite good, began to decline dramatically, her parents pulled her from the high school and enrolled her in an alternative high school. They also began sending her to grief counseling. But not long after joining this alternative high school did Rachel drop out, so she did not get her high school diploma. Her parents were not happy about this decision, but they did understand their child's life had been completely disrupted in a catastrophic way over the past year. I mean, the trauma she had experienced already as this young person was more than what most adults would experience in their entire lifetime. And so they honored their daughter's decision to drop out, and they just gave her some space to try to figure out what she wanted to do next. After dropping out of school in the spring of 2002, Rachel got a job at a local pizza and pasta shop in town, but after only a couple of months, she quit. She did pick up some hours babysitting that summer, but for the most part, she spent her time just sitting in her room, alone and sad. Then one day, her father looked at the family's phone bill and saw it was significantly higher than normal. When he reviewed all of the individual charges, he saw there was one that really stood out to him. There were dozens and dozens of collect calls that had been placed from an inmate at a correctional facility. When he confronted his daughter about these calls, she would tell him that yes, she was speaking to an inmate at a correctional facility, and his name was John Anderson. He was 20 years old. He went by Diggy, that was his nickname, and that she and Diggy were in this sort of new romantic relationship. She told her father that she had met Diggy a year earlier at a high school party. This was before he was sent to jail on drug and burglary charges. And he had been very interested in her at the time, but she wasn't interested in him. Despite the rejection, though, Diggy continued to pursue Rachel well after this party, but it wasn't until a year later, when she had dropped out of high school, that she finally decided to give him a shot. Rachel would tell her father that Diggy, despite being a convicted criminal, was very misunderstood. He was actually a very nice guy who just had a troubled past, and that was why he kept getting in trouble with the law. Her father did not approve and was very worried about his daughter, but he wanted to be supportive and felt like he didn't really know the whole situation, and so he just told her, please just be careful. Not long after this father-daughter talk, Diggy got out of prison, and so Rachel, who had spent the better part of the last year shut up in her room, was now suddenly going out all the time to see him and his group of friends. It's important to understand here that Diggy and his group of friends were in reality just a group of petty criminals and drug dealers for the most part. However, they thought of themselves as a full-fledged, organized criminal gang, and they were very proud of it. And they even referred to themselves as the Northwest Mafia, and Diggy was very clearly their leader. Quickly, it became apparent to Rachel's family that a big part of, quote, spending time with Diggy and the Northwest Mafia was partying and doing drugs and drinking alcohol. And so naturally, the parents were very concerned for their daughter, who they felt was really starting to go down the wrong path in life. So over the next couple of months, Rachel's parents and her sister all tried to gently convince Rachel to stop spending so much time with Diggy and his crew because they were a totally bad influence on her. But Rachel was adamant that Diggy and his crew was making her happy, and that right now, that was what she needed, that she needed to be around them, that they were really just awesome people, and that you gotta trust her. And her family, they didn't trust her. They felt like, maybe she's going through a phase where she wants to date, a bad boy. They didn't really get it, but they also didn't have a way of getting through to her. It seemed like she was just convinced this is what she needed to be doing now, and so they just were kind of at a loss. Then, one day, it seemed like everything had just magically fallen into place. It was on a sunny morning in late July of that year. Rachel's father was outside working on his garden when his daughter, Rachel, suddenly appeared looking happier than she had in a long time. Bill smiled back at her and was like, "What's going on? Why are you so happy?" And she would tell him that she had a plan. She was going back to school and she was going to become a medical technician. And she was just absolutely beaming as she's telling him this news. When she was asked what had brought about this incredible change, she explained that she had recently made a new friend who was encouraging her to do this. She said his name was Maurice Rivas. He was 18 years old like she was, and he was a part of the Northwest Mafia. She told her dad that she had previously interacted with him when she first started seeing Diggy a few months earlier, but she had never really had a real conversation with him. She'd only just kind of waved and said hi whenever they were at gatherings together. But a few days earlier, when she was at a Northwest Mafia party, she and Maurice just kind of happened to find themselves alone, and so they struck up a friendly conversation. And during that talk, Maurice confided in Rachel that he was actually really unhappy and he wanted to leave the Northwest Mafia and he wanted to go back to school since he had actually dropped out of high school as well. And when Rachel heard him say this, she had an epiphany. She realized she felt exactly the way he did. She didn't like being in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't even know why she was in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't know why she was seeing Diggy. And it was like it all clicked for her. And so she confided in Maurice, this guy who she barely knew. She said, you know what? I feel the same way. I don't want to spend time with these people. I want to go back to school. And so this random conversation they had at this party really immediately bonded them together. It was like they both had been harboring this deep, dark secret, but now only with each other, they could discuss it openly. And it was very liberating for them. And so by the end of this first real conversation they had had, the pair had promised each other that they were going to get out of the Northwest Mafia. They were going to go back to school. They were going to clean up their acts. They were going to fix their lives. And they were going to do it together. They were going to support each other and have each other's back. Rachel would even joke with her father that they were already talking about when they went back to school that they would go to senior prom together, although she assured her dad that their relationship was totally platonic. This was not a romantic thing. Bill, her father, had no idea what to say. This was literally the best case scenario. It was the thing her family had been hoping for over these last several months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. And so he told Rachel he was so proud of her. He gave her a big hug and said, look, if you need anything, just let me know. And Rachel smiled and she gave him a hug back. And then she turned around and skipped back inside the house. And sure enough, over the next 2 months, Rachel did act very differently. She started very intentionally getting her life back together. She started spending more time at home with her family, and she started going to church with her mom, and she also began reconnecting with some of her older high school friends who had always been a positive influence on her. And so by September of that year, Rachel did seem like she was more or less back to her old happy self. Except there was one element of her life, of her old life, so to speak, that she was not able to shake. And that was her relationship with Diggy. She just could not end it. She had tried to, but apparently he didn't want to break up. And so they fell into this sort of weird on and off again relationship that kept Rachel periodically going back to these Northwest Mafia gatherings. Her family was obviously unhappy about this particular detail, but they did feel confident that given her recent changes, that she would eventually break it off for good with Diggy. And so until that happened, they were actually quietly grateful that her new friend Maurice was also still spending time with the Northwest Mafia. He too was kind of struggling to fully break contact with them. And so the family was thinking, well, yeah, they do need to leave, but for the time being, when they're at these gatherings, at least they'll have each other. On September 23rd of that year, Rachel was invited to a Northwest Mafia get-together, and she did agree to go. Before she left her house, she did not give her family very much information about what she was doing or where she was going. All they knew was that apparently she was going out to see some friends. And so that night, when Rachel did not come back home, her family was definitely concerned about her, but they assumed she must have made plans to stay out at this friend or friend's house for the night. And since she didn't have a cell phone, they couldn't call her to confirm that, and so they just had to wait until the next day to see if she would show up again. But the next day arrived, and Rachel did not show up again, and when her family began calling around to her various friends' houses, both old and new, no one seemed to know where she was. For a couple of days, the family continued to call around town and even drove around town putting up posters, asking people to come forward if they had seen her, but there was no sign of her. And so finally, on September 27th, the family went to police and they officially reported Rachel missing. The police immediately jumped into action, sending out units to scour all corners of Everett, Washington, and the surrounding areas. They also began questioning virtually anyone who was even remotely affiliated with Rachel in hopes they might know something. But despite this really aggressive initial push by police, it led to nothing. Then, out of nowhere, someone very unexpected came forward and gave the police a huge tip. And this tip would ultimately lead police to discover the truly unbelievable story of what happened to Rachel. The following is that story. After leaving her house on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day she told her family she was going to see friends, Rachel made the short drive over to 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace's house. He was going to be the host for that evening's get-together with the Northwest Mafia. When she arrived, Nathan, along with Rachel's good friend Maurice and a 17-year-old named Matthew Durham, were sitting in the living room, and while they waited for more friends of theirs to arrive, Nathan's father suddenly came home. Apparently, he had gotten off work early, and so not wanting to hang out around the prying eyes of a parent, the trio decided it would be better if they just left and spent their night at someone else's house. And so they made their way over to Kevin Jihad's house. Kevin was a 32-year-old, and he owned his own place. When they arrived, they found Kevin, along with 22-year-olds John Whitaker and Jeffrey Barth, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, all sitting around in the living room, just kind of joking around. They're playing video games, they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking marijuana. Rachel, along with Maurice, Nathan, and Matthew, just took up spots on the couch right near the entrance to the room, and before long, they were joking around and having a good time too. At 4 p.m., Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Diggy, stormed into Kevin's living room looking furious. Without warning, he punched two of the guys sitting nearest Rachel, and then he pulled out a gun and he began aiming it wildly around the room. And this instantly silenced the group because no one knew what he was on about. And Rachel, who's sitting right near the door, she does not want to be part of this, and she's thinking this has nothing to do with me, and so she decides she's going to get up and kind of slip out and let them deal with Diggy and whatever is going on in here. And so she stands up, trying to be as quiet and small as she can, and she begins edging towards the door. But in order to fully leave the living room and escape this situation, she would need to walk right past Diggy, who was standing in the doorway. And as she got closer to him, about to make that move out of the room, Diggy seemed to notice her, and he put his gun down, and he turned to face her, and then he turned his whole body so he was squared up with Rachel as if he was getting ready to fight her. And then Rachel just kind of tried to make herself as small and as timid as she possibly could, and she tried to just slip past him, but right as she did, Diggy reached out with his left hand and he grabbed her scalp, he grabbed her hair, and then he wound up and he blasted her in the face with his right hand, and then with his left he kind of chucked her back into the room she had just tried to escape from. And then the worst night of Rachel's life would begin. As soon as she hit the floor in that room, she tried to scramble back to her feet, but before she could, she was getting punched and kicked by Diggy and several other of her friends who had just been sitting in the room joking around with her, and then the others who were in the room who were not actively participating in beating her, which included Maurice Rivas. They sat there idly doing nothing while Rachel screamed for their help. When her screams got so loud, Diggy was concerned the neighbors would hear her. One of the idle onlookers in the room, 20-year-old Tony Williams, simply turned the music up to drown her screams out. After a few horrible, violent minutes, Diggy told the others to stop, at which point he reached down and he grabbed Rachel's hair again and dragged her out of the room, and then he dragged her across the kitchen floor and through a door that led into the garage. Once she was inside the garage, he jammed a dirty sock into her mouth and he covered her mouth over with duct tape, and then he bound her wrists and her body with rope, and then once he was certain she could neither make any noise or go anywhere, he pushed her over so she was laying on her side all bound up, and then he just left. He went back into the house and back into the living room with the others. What Rachel was not aware of was this entire night was a setup. Diggy was furious with her, most likely due to a combination of rage that she had tried to break up with him and just jealousy that she was now showing affection to other men in the group, such as Maurice and a few others. And so Diggy had ordered the other members of the Northwest Mafia to help put her in her place. It was unclear exactly what he meant by this, but all of the Mafia members knew this meant physically harming Rachel in some way, and they agreed to it. Originally, the plan had been to lure her to Nathan's house under the false pretenses of just a normal night hanging out with some friends, and then at some point, Nathan, Matthew, and her close friend Maurice would abduct her and bring her to Diggy for whatever else he had planned for her. But Nathan's dad had come home early before they could enact their plan, and so when that happened, Nathan had to sneak off and privately call Diggy and ask what to do next. And Diggy, who was totally frustrated by this, just said, you know what, bring her to Kevin's house and we will all deal with her when she gets here. So when Rachel sat down on the couch in Kevin's house next to Maurice and her other friends, who she thought she was just enjoying a fun night out with, in reality, they were all acting. They were trying to act like this was just another night and kind of get her off guard so that when Diggy came storming into the room pretending to be mad, which was the sign they would all attack her. But now that the plan had worked and Rachel had fallen into their trap and had gotten badly beaten up and was restrained and helpless in the garage, Diggy didn't have a plan for what they were going to do next. So instead of doing anything, the 8 guys who had just beaten up and restrained Rachel just simply went back to doing drugs and drinking and playing video games in the living room. Then, a few hours later at 9 p.m., Kevin's girlfriend, Trisha Connor, she came home, and when she did, she entered the house through the garage. And when she saw Rachel laying on the ground, restrained, badly beaten up, her left eye is totally swollen, she ran over to her because, one, she actually didn't know who Rachel was. So this is just a random girl in her garage that's beaten up and restrained. And so she runs over to her, she rips the tape off of her mouth, she pulls the sock out, and right away, Rachel is pleading with her to let her go, she won't tell anyone, and Trisha is totally confused because she really has no clue what's going on. She was not a part of the plan to harm this girl, and so Trisha just instinctively runs into the house. She does not make any contact with the guys in the living room. She goes straight into the kitchen and she gets a knife, and then she runs back into the garage and she begins cutting through all of Rachel's restraints to free her. But before she could finish the job, Diggy apparently had heard the commotion of Trisha coming in and heard her running around the house. And so Diggy comes storming into the garage. He sees what Trisha is doing. He runs over and he grabs her hands and he physically stops her from freeing Rachel. And then he threatens Trisha that he's going to harm her if she lets Rachel go. And so Trisha, amazingly, at this point, despite clearly seeing something very bad is happening to this girl, instead of continuing to try to fight this and figure out what's going on and maybe try to help this girl, she just gets mad at Diggy and says, "I don't want this in my house. What are you doing? I don't want this girl in my house. You know what? I'm going to call the cops if you don't get rid of her." Meaning, I don't care what you do with her, but I don't want this in my house. I don't want to be involved with whatever this is. And then she promptly begins to leave Rachel alone with Diggy. She starts walking away, and Rachel, she's heartbroken. This was her way out. She was about to be let go, and now Trisha is leaving her behind. And so Rachel's begging her to come back. "Please, you gotta let me go." But Trisha didn't listen. She walked into the house and shut the door behind her. And then Diggy, who was still in the garage, he just immediately turned around. He tied Rachel back up. He stuffed the sock back in her mouth. He taped her shut. And then he went right back into the house and shut the door, leaving Rachel all alone again. But a few minutes later, Diggy would come back, this time with John Whitaker, and the two of them would show up with this black duffel bag, this huge bag. And they walk over to Rachel, who's now whimpering in the corner. She'd kind of pushed herself to the side. And they lifted her up and they forced her small body into this black bag, and then they zipped it shut. And while they did this, Matthew Durham, who had been in the living room, he had gone outside and gotten his red Jeep, and he had backed it up to the closed garage door. And then once Diggy and John had Rachel secured in this bag, they opened the garage door up and they put her in the back of the Jeep and they shut the Jeep's back door. And then Diggy ordered John, along with Matthew and Rachel's friend Maurice, who had just come outside, to just go drive around town with Rachel in the trunk until he, Diggy, figured out what they were going to do next. And so the trio hopped in the red Jeep and did what their leader told them to do. They began driving around Everett with Rachel in the trunk. And this whole time, Rachel could clearly hear anything that was said inside of the vehicle, but apparently during this initial drive around, the trio didn't talk. So it's unclear if she understood who was actually with her. But eventually, during this drive around, one of the 3 young men in the Jeep got a call from Diggy, who told them he had his plan, so come pick him up. At this point, the trio decide, for whatever reason, to just dump Rachel somewhere, basically stash her somewhere in her bag, and go pick up Diggy. And then once they had Diggy, they would go back, they would get Rachel, and then they would figure out what they were going to do. They'd hear the plan that Diggy had in store. And so Matthew drove the red Jeep about 10 miles north of Everett to a quiet cul-de-sac in this suburban neighborhood. And then once the Jeep was stopped, Matthew and Maurice got out and they went around to the back of the Jeep, they opened it up, and they pulled Rachel out of the trunk and they walked her over and put her behind some big tree on someone's front property. Now, it's nighttime, this was not a well-lit up area, and so they thought by putting her behind this tree, she'd be out of sight of the road and, no one would see her. And they also decided that one of them would need to stay back and guard her to make sure she didn't escape or that nobody did accidentally find her. And they decided Maurice would be the one who would stay back and do that. And so after Rachel has been planted behind this tree, Maurice made his way over and he sat down next to her. And then Matthew and John, they just drove off in the Jeep to go get Diggy. And so once the Jeep had driven off, Rachel, who could clearly hear their discussions and she could hear the Jeep pulling off, she knows she is now alone with her good friend Maurice. And so this is her opportunity to plead with him to help her. And so as soon as she hears that Jeep is gone, she starts screaming through her gag on her mouth to try to get his attention. And it worked. Maurice quickly unzipped the bag and pulled her gag off, but he didn't untie her. And right away, Rachel, she is so upset. She's frantic. And she says to Maurice, "They're going to kill me if you don't get me out of here. You have to free me." And Maurice was just very nonchalant. And he said, "Yeah, I think you're making a big deal about this. You're going to be fine. Just go along with it. It's not a big deal." But Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. And so she's saying, "Maurice, don't you get it? They are going to kill me. This is the chance. Let me out. Save me. You're supposed to be my friend. Let me go." But Maurice just continued to do nothing. He just kept telling her it wasn't a big deal. She was blowing this up out of proportion. And then at some point, Rachel, after quite a bit of time had passed, and now she's thinking, Diggy and the others, they're going to be back soon. And so she says to Maurice, "You know what? If they're going to kill me, I just don't want to be drowned. I'm terrified of being drowned. At least make them shoot me. Make it quick." And at this, Maurice just doesn't say anything. And instead, he reaches down and he grabs the sock and he puts it in Rachel's mouth. He puts the tape over her mouth and then he presses her down into the bag and he zips it shut. And then he waits for Diggy and the others to come back. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, Matthew, John, and Diggy returned in the Jeep to the cul-de-sac. They got out and they lifted Rachel up inside of the bag and they brought her back over and put her in the trunk of the Jeep, which now contained 4 new shovels. And then once the trunk was shut, all 4 men piled inside as well. And then Diggy told Matthew to head out to a particular off-roading spot he was familiar with. It was about 30 miles to the northeast. And over the course of this hour-long drive, Rachel could hear everything being said inside of this Jeep. And she would have heard all the details of exactly what Diggy had planned for her. And so she knows what's going to happen to her, but she can't do anything about it. She's just bound in the back of this Jeep. And so around midnight, they reached their destination, this off-roading site, which was basically this thick forest at the foot of a mountain near a small pond. And once they parked, the men got out, leaving Rachel in the trunk with the trunk shut, and they began walking around the back of the vehicle and started looking on the ground until Diggy said he had found a spot that he really liked, and it was about 10 or 15 feet behind the vehicle. And so once this spot was identified, the men walked back to the Jeep, they opened up the trunk, and they left Rachel, but they pulled out their shovels. Diggy, John, and Matthew, they all took their shovels and walked to this designated spot on the ground, and they began digging, but Maurice didn't. He stayed back at the Jeep, standing right against the trunk with Rachel right behind him. So again, he has this opportunity where, in theory, he could help Rachel, but while she whimpered behind him and tried to get his attention and tried to get him to help her, he just ignored her, and he pulled out a cigarette and he began smoking, and he also had a soda that he was drinking. And so he's just standing there doing nothing. And at some point, Diggy looks up and notices this, and he yells at Maurice to come help them, get your shovel and start digging. And so Maurice, reluctantly, puts a cigarette out, throws his soda can away, and then he grabbed the last remaining shovel, and then he walked away from Rachel and the Jeep over to this site, and he began to dig as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, Rachel, who's still in the trunk is open, she's still in the bag, she's forced to listen to the sound of these 4 people dig what sounds like a very sizable hole. And then when they finally stopped digging, she heard them chuck their shovels aside and start walking back over to her. And when they reached her, they unzipped the bag and they pulled her out and they sat her down on the back of this Jeep. So she's kind of sitting, looking in the direction of this dig site. And as they begin cutting off her restraints and removing the tape from her mouth, she gets a clear view of what they had been digging. And she knows immediately what it is. They were digging her grave. After all the restraints and everything was off of her, Diggy ordered John to start taking all of her clothes and jewelry off. Rachel knew at this point she was about to die. There was nothing she could do to stop it. She was outnumbered. She was in the middle of nowhere. She would have been overpowered. So she knows she's going to die. And so she had nothing to lose. And so when John grabbed her and tried to rip her clothes off, she fought back aggressively. And she looks at Diggy and she says, "At least allow me the dignity of removing my clothes and jewelry myself." And so Diggy looks at her and he says, "Fine. And so all of the men back up, and then Rachel, in front of these 4 people who earlier that day she would have considered her friends, she began taking all of her clothes off. And then after she had removed all of her clothes and all of her jewelry, she left one ring on her hand, and she clutched it with her other hand, and she looked at Diggy and said, "Can I please just keep this one?" The ring she was holding on to was a ring that her good friend Corey Haynes had given her right before he was killed in that car accident. And Diggy just says, "No." And he reaches out and he literally pulls it off of her hand. And so standing there completely naked and alone and terrified, Rachel was then ordered by Diggy to start walking towards the grave. And so Rachel, with as much grace as she could muster, stood up straight, took a deep breath, and began walking. And then she finally reached the edge of the grave, at which point Diggy told her to walk down inside. And so Rachel very carefully turned around and lowered herself down into the grave, and then she stood up in the middle of the grave with her back to her attackers, at which point Diggy said, "Get on your knees." And so she did this, and as soon as she was down on her knees, she looked skyward and she pressed her hands together and put them right up against her chest, and she began praying. And as she's looking upward towards the sky, Diggy laughs at her and says, "Don't worry, you'll be up there soon." And then Diggy pulled his gun out, he aimed it at her back, and he began firing the gun. And he shot several times into the back of her head, into her back, and then his gun jammed, at which point he cleared the jam, he reloaded his gun, and then fired even more shots into her body. And then he put his gun away, and he, along with the other 3 men who had just witnessed this and participated in this, used their shovels to fill the hole back in, covering her up. Once she was buried, the men rounded up all of her things, along with the shovels and the murder weapon, and they chucked it into the nearby pond. Diggy made sure to crush the ring Rachel had said was so important to her before he threw it into the water. Then the men climbed back into the red Jeep and they drove back to Everett. And on the ride, Diggy would tell them that if they told anyone about what they had just done, he would kill them too. But just a few days later, after Rachel had been reported missing, the mother of Jeffrey Barth. Jeffrey was someone who had been at Kevin Jihad's house on the night Rachel was abducted, and he also played a role in her capture. His mother, Jeffrey Barth's mother, behind his back, went to police and told them that she thought her son knew something about Rachel's disappearance. And so the police, they rushed to Jeffrey and they interviewed him, and he would quickly say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but you should talk to Matthew Durham." Matthew, if you remember, was the driver the night Rachel was killed. He also helped dig her grave and he witnessed her murder. And when police spoke to Matthew, at first he refused to speak and tried to act tough, but when the police ratcheted up the pressure, he cracked and he told them everything, including where to find Rachel's body. And as soon as it became clear the police had Rachel's body, every other member of the Northwest Mafia who had been involved in Rachel's murder rushed to speak with the police because they were all trying to save themselves by blaming the other people in the group. And so that is why we have such a clear picture of exactly what happened to Rachel in her final moments, because those responsible told the police everything. During their trials, all 8 of the accused Northwest Mafia members were smug and did not take responsibility for their actions. But the worst of all of them by far was Diggy. During his trial, he smiled, and he even repeatedly turned around to look at Rachel's family so he could laugh at them and wink at them. Ultimately, all 8 of the accused were found guilty of various charges ranging from rendering criminal assistance all the way up to first-degree murder. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, whose home was supposed to be the site of the kidnapping, was sentenced to 116 days in jail. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who turned the volume of the music up to drown out Rachel's screams, and who also got the duct tape for Diggy when he was restraining Rachel in the garage, he received slightly more than 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who played a large role in subduing and kidnapping Rachel, and whose mother had gone to police and tipped them off about what had happened, he received 10 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was Rachel's closest friend in the group and who had pledged to support her and have her back as they got their lives together, he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in prison for assisting in Rachel's abduction and helping dig her grave. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who drove the Jeep that carried Rachel to her death and who also helped dig Rachel's grave, he received 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Kevin Jihad, who was determined to have masterminded the finer details of the abduction and the murder, he was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison for being directly involved in the entire abduction and murder process. And 20-year-old John Diggy Anderson, the leader of the Northwest Mafia and Rachel's ex-boyfriend, he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in her murder. Throughout Rachel's horrible ordeal, there were many people who could have stepped in and stopped what was happening to her, most notably Trissa Connor, who was Kevin Jihad's girlfriend and who found Rachel tied up in the garage, and Maurice Rivas, who was alone with Rachel in that cul-de-sac and could have easily freed her, but didn't. As a result of these heart-wrenching details, Rachel's family and their legal team worked very hard to pass a bill called SHB 1236. This bill makes it a criminal offense in America if you do not summon assistance for a person that has suffered substantial bodily harm. They are hoping this will save at least one person from suffering unnecessarily. Today, the Berkheimer family is still grieving the loss of their Rachel. However, her father, Bill, takes solace in a particular photograph the police showed him. After Rachel's gravesite was discovered and her body was removed from it, the police took a photo of the grave itself. And in this photo, you can see an imprint in the soil of Rachel's hands where she fell after she was shot. And it looks like her hands were pressed together near her chest, meaning she was likely praying in her final moments on Earth. And Bill likes to believe that means she was at peace when she finally died.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.